first speaker will be Richard Baines of Scotland. Richard is with the Royal Botanical Garden, Edinburgh, at Logan, and the author of the recently published book, Plant Explorer, A Plantsman Travels in Northern Vietnam. He'll be doing a PowerPoint presentation covering the work of Logan in relation to Magnolia conservation in Vietnam and link it to the expanding living Magnolia collection at Logan.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening from wherever you're listening to in the world. Today I'm going to be giving a talk on Magnolia conservation in northwest Vietnam. The talk will be about 3 expeditions which took place in 2014, 2016, and 2019. They took place for approximately 3 to 4 weeks each year during October and November. They took place with in conjunction with various partners engaged in the expedition, namely Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania, USA, the Institute of Biology and Ecological Resources in Hanoi, the Royal Botanic Gardens Kew, Cambridge Botanic Gardens, the National Botanic Garden of Wales, and the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh. So we had many different partners, each bringing a particular asset to the expedition. The main focus of the collecting trips was essentially to collect material, mainly in the form of seed, from various plant groups, such as endangered magnolias, rhododendrons, gingers, and rare conifers, mainly in the form of seed, bring them back into botanic gardens, and then from then they would become part of an ex situ conservation project. Now, I should say at this moment in time that prior to the expedition, a lot of work went in to make sure that MOUs were in place with IEBR in Hanoi. We had all the necessary collecting permits, the import permits, quarantine import permits, etc. So the official paperwork was all in place. We're indebted to our host organization in Vietnam, as I mentioned, the Institute of Ecology and Biological Resources, for their support in help and setting up the trip. So let's have a look at whereabouts Hanoi is. And so this is Vietnam, and the area which we're interested in is up here, up in the northwest. So we flew into Hanoi, bounded to the north by China, to the west by Laos, and this is the area of underexplored mountain areas. So the first thing I should say that before we actually went out, we consulted a publication called the Selected Threatened Magnolia Species of Hà Province. And this was created by Flora and Fauna International and 1 or 2 other national bodies. And there's some great information on it, which notes all the threatened species of magnolias in that particular area. It tells you the location, it gives you clear illustrations. So that was a good start. So before we actually went on the trip, we did a lot of research. So typical weather in Hanoi, when it rains a little bit like Scotland, it absolutely pours with rain. So here you see us just after day 1 of arriving. In Hanoi, there are masses of mopeds wherever you look around. I'm not sure which highway code rules are following, but there are certainly bikes buzzing left, right, and centre. And it was great entertainment for us to have a seat at a restaurant with all these buzzing down beneath us. People carry all sorts of things, from live animals to plants to scaffolding poles. In Sapa itself, which is a village which we based ourselves, originally a French mountain village, beautiful costumes. There are 7 different tribes in the area, and unfortunately, during the last sort of 7 years when we've been going to Hanoi, this is something which is quickly dying out. They're great colours. And here we see a typical picture from us during our 2014 trip. This is Du here at the right-hand side, myself, some other members of the Vietnamese expedition, Andy Hill from the University of British Columbia, Matt and Jim from Longwood Gardens, and Andrew Luke here from Kew. So this is why one of the main reasons why we were going to collect seed from Magnolias. Here's our official guide with the lovely red jewels which are hanging from the seed pods. And for every successful expedition, generally you need a good range of porters to carry the goods, to assist you to carry the food, the water, etc. up the mountains. So we were collecting seeds. We tried to avoid bringing any living material, any vegetation back to the UK, really to minimise the possibility of pests and diseases. The seeds were collected in these linen bags here, and this is Andrew Luke here collecting the various seed materials which would be dried off later in our hotel. But you can see just how rich the vegetation is. When you're on expeditions like this, you need to be very flexible and you just need to get on with things. And this is our accommodation, very, very basic, basically a wooden floor here on the right-hand side, a building made from trunks of trees and a tarpaulin, and you just throw your roll mat down, put your sleeping bag over it and get on with it, and you just sleep alongside other people. Maybe people who are big snorers, you just have to get on with it. I should say you had to get also used to plenty of leeches and rats and mice all running around. So when we got up the next day, this is a photo of what we were met with. Beautiful pictures of the Hoang Lien Son mountain range, often known as a fancy pan, very densely covered in vegetation. And it was quite daunting to think that by the end of the day, you had to be at the top of that mountain. We weren't there in spring, but this gives you an idea in the springtime what the actual hillsides look like. These are rhododendrons. There's about 40 different species of rhododendrons which grow in this area, but covered in, mass planting, very dense vegetation, very, very rich flora. So our first magnolia, which grows in this particular area, is Magnolia chevalierii, native to Laos and Vietnam. It's an evergreen, like so many of the other magnolias. It grows approximately to about 6 meters tall, and it has very long, glossy green leaves. It generally bears solitary white flowers, which are about 10 centimeters across, followed by brilliant red, erect fruit protruding red seeds. And it grows on a fancy pan at roughly about 2,100 meters. This is rarely seen in cultivation. It's a great plant. In cultivation, when you're growing it, it requires a nice sheltered, well-drained site. So Magnolia chevalierii. This was us when we got to the top of the fancy pan, roughly 3,143 meters. It took us just over 2 days to climb it. We did it all by hand, but now there's actually a cable car which goes to the top. So it was quite an achievement for us. We were all very pleased. It was very, very muddy towards the end, but the richness of the floor at the top was quite amazing. To give you an idea of what it was like at night, so we either gently pitched in cardamom huts or had small tents, and this was a typical meal in a cardamom hut where you had a small bench and you've got lots of rice, local greens from the forest, local pork, generally with quite a lot of fat on, but this is very, very typical. And again, I found it quite challenging to acclimatize to completely different food. And my way of coping with it was I brought 3-in-1 coffees, some Mars bars and a cup of soups just in case. But overall, the food was fine. This was as in 2014. So to date, I think we've named about 4 different new plant species which are new to science. And this is Rhododendron tetrapeploides. This is the plant here with the lovely mahogany stems, new to science, similar to Rhododendron tetrapeplum, but much bigger flowers. Typical scenes as you travelled around the country, along the roadsides, locals selling lots of sugarcane, peanuts, lemons, all sorts of different vegetables, all lovely and fresh, and lots of good sustainable growing on there in terms of people having rice paddies, and also in terms of carp being grown in the paddy fields, etc. So really good to see that. One of the largest species of Aesculus is Aesculus wangii, and Aesculus wangii is critically endangered in the wild with less than 80 mature trees. And we've collected this, and this is one of the plants which we've got growing at Logan, and there's also one certainly growing at Kew. It has an enormous seed, and it really is a fantastic plant, but again, greatly threatened with extinction. Next Magnolia we saw was Magnolia floribunda var. Tonkinensis, which grows again on the fancy pan, roughly at an altitude of 2,300 meters. It's got a very wide distribution, distributed through Laos, Thailand, China, and Vietnam, and it can grow up to an amazing 28 meters tall. The young shoots are often covered in fine hairs, affording this plant a very elegant appearance, whereas the larger, older leaves are much darker, leathery, and thick textured, to 20 centimeters long. It has beautiful, lovely flowers which are highly fragrant, and fragrant smells of honey. Best grown in sunlight or slight shade, away from freezing winds, and in the UK it's certainly ideally suited to gardens along the west coast. But a really beautiful colour of flower. So one of the challenges of northern Vietnam is that it's very, very humid. The temperatures when we are there in October, November are probably in the low 20s, but 100% humidity. Here you can see the silhouettes of the trees as we wandered around. And here you see a big fishtail palm in the centre. But very, very humid, very, very, once you get wet, it's difficult to get anything dry. Some of the typical landscapes. This was the landscape at Bac des Sons, and there are about 80 of these small drumlins here, which all have a very defined and very rich flora. They're all very similar, but quite different. And in recent years, there's been a number of new species which have been found on these drumlins. And I should say that there are probably many more still to be discovered. So at night, you generally stop for a bite to eat along one of these. Most of these little villages and towns just had one cafe, so you had to go in and get some food at one of those. Very, very rich, very, very steep. We had a very close call one day in where the actual loose shaly material created a landslide and actually went over, some of the rocks actually went over one of the participants, which was quite a near call. So here you see, us sort of clambering up some of the mountainsides. And on the previous photographs, this was one of the plants which was actually discovered on one of the drumlins. And this is Trachycarpus geminisectus with its bifold leaves. New to science. This was on our 2016 expedition. And this shows a picture just at sunset on the fancy pan on our descent. But great camaraderie. You never really know what lies ahead for you. You take every day as it comes. You need to be flexible. You've got to stay positive. It might be pouring with rain, but the treasures are amazing at the end. So on expeditions, there's a lot which can go wrong. There's a lot of uncertainty. things crop up as you go along. And this was one day when we climbed Take on Lynn Mountain. So our guide said to me, Richard, I've got a question for you. We can either go up to the top of the mountain on the back of motorbikes, 23 kilometers, so no short journey, or we can walk it, which will probably take us a couple of days. So we opted to go on the back of motorbikes, and I have to say that I've never ever been on such an exhilarating journey. We passed streams and landslides, all sorts of things. You had to duck your head, you had to push the motorbike. But once we got to the top, it was incredible. The trees in the back here, there was lots of Calicedrus macrolepis, and there was a chap who lived at the top, who was a conservation officer, and he got about 6 visitors a year, and was he happy to see us. Some of the vegetation on the way up, this is Cynorundinaria griffithii, and this formed dense stands and really kept the light out and kept other vegetation from growing. Quite an amazing thing and an eerie thing to be in the middle of a bamboo forest. So one of the differences between any other expedition which I've ever been on and going to Vietnam is that generally when you're pressing specimens, you press specimens, getting them as dry as you can, pressing them between sheets of newspaper in a press. But because it is so wet, what we generally do is put them in a press between sheets of newspaper, tie them all up, and then preserve them in alcohol. And then these are drained of alcohol once you go back to Hanoi. And that helps to preserve them. It is a great way of preserving them. The only problem is some of the colour sometimes washes out of some of the specimens. But it's really practically the only way you can actually dry specimens because of the moisture. Some idea of the local markets with the array of different meats on offer, everything from dogs to cows to porcupine, it's all there. And one of the things which always amazes me, these are in the open air, not refrigerated, but it all seems quite fresh. But if you didn't have an appetite, I'm not sure if you would have had an appetite at the end of this. Travelling round again, one of the things which is happening very extensively is that the native flora is being pushed up the mountains. So where magnolias, for example, grow, they've been forced higher and higher up the mountains, and fruits such as this dragon fruit here are being grown more and more commercially. Really nice thing to eat, and it comes from pepperthorn. So the next magnolia which we came across was Magnolia cathcartii, which again has quite a wide distribution. Grows in Bhutan, Myanmar, China, India, Thailand, and Vietnam. And as a tree, it grows to roughly 25 meters tall. It grows in montane evergreen forests between an altitude of 1,200 and 2,800 meters, so quite a wide altitudinal range. It's got very leathery leaves, which are thin. Its leaves are 7 to 17 centimeters long, so quite long. It then produces solitary flowers, which are terminal and fragrant. And in the UK, it generally flowers in May. Flowers are very showy, up to 17 centimeters across. A beautiful plant. If you're wondering what the specific epithet relates to, it commemorates a Joseph F. Cathcart of the colonial era, Bengal Civil Service, who commissioned large numbers of illustrations of Himalayan plants. And again, like so many of the other magnolias, if you're wanting to grow it in cultivation, it's best grown in light shade, away from freezing winds, in a dry, in a fairly free-draining soil. Here we see a top of the fancy pan. So here you would see quite a number of rhododendrons, such as Rhododendron cremulatum, Rhododendron valentinianum, all very, very rich. Travelling around, it's not for the faint-hearted. You have to be very, very careful. There are very steep slopes which can easily be met by disaster and great care. It's very unwise to travel to these parts of the world yourself. You need to be in good company and take all the necessary steps, just to show you how dangerous it can be. You need luck on these expeditions, so you can imagine if it was pouring with rain, this particular path here, which we need to ascend to reach to the top, is a bit like a raging torrent. So we were fortunate on our day when we went up the path here. It was reasonable weather, and we managed to ascend it. You could just imagine what it was like. Traveling around, this is Hajiang, up in the very northern part on the Chinese border. You've got massive bamboos here. There are quite a number of unusual magnolias, but limestone karst, very densely covered in really exciting flora. So that was our aim, to check these particular hills out. So one of the great plants which was named in the last 2 decades on the Fansipan mountain is Magnolia sapiensis, which commemorates the town of Sapa. It was described by, I believe, Nick Mesa and John Grimshaw, and it forms generally a large shrub or multi-stem tree with large paddle-shaped leaves. Very glossy green above and white below. It's endemic to northern Vietnam and grows at approximately 2,200 meters. Once established, it is fast growing and it's fairly hardy. This certainly to date has come through -15. It grows best in partial shade, again away from freezing winds. The specimen you can see here on the left-hand side was collected in 2014, and in 2022 had over 50 flowers on it. So it's very free flowering at a young age and fast growing. Flowers are cream and purple beneath. But what we've been trying to do at Logan, our philosophy, is to try and plant, rather than just one plant of these magnolias out, is to plant, 10, 15 of them out, so that we've got some really good genetic diversity there, which can be used, for ex situ conservation. So here we see the close-up of the flowers. You can see the cluster of stamens. The flowers are very short-lived. They normally flower in early summer, but really lovely, and it really brings a new dimension. So many of the magnolias which we grow in Western gardens are spring flowering. This one usually flowers in July. These were some of the plants which we were growing on in the greenhouse from seed, being grown on in retainers. These grow particularly well. The roots where they meet the holes in the pot form nodes, and they tend to establish much better. Really good drainage. I would strongly recommend trainers for growing on young magnolias. So as we travelled around, we saw lots of wildlife and lots of activity in the fields with the water buffalo, which you generally use for ploughing. Here you see all the paddy fields, which should be growing all the rice, etc. Quite a few snakes. I'm not sure which particular one this one here was. We saw quite a number of these python-like ones here, but we kept well out of the way of them. And also this segmented fluorescent worm, which was quite amazing. It was about 30 centimeters long and just slithered its way through the leaf litter on the forest floor. So with the seeds, when we collected them, we generally dried them off in the hotel on the floor. And once they were all completely dried, we put them in these packets here, which took a lot of time. So, when you're on an expedition, the days are very long. You get up at the crack of dawn, you've got your notes to write up. So the notes encompass the name of the plant, the number of the plant, the ecology, the habitat. You'd have a herbarium specimen, very detailed photographs, detailed descriptions. So all this work needs to be done as much as possible out in the field. And then when you come at the end of an expedition, after you've climbed a mountain, you generally get everything up to date. But these seeds here need to be dried off as much as possible, as quickly as possible. And obviously you've got orthodox and recalcitrant seed amongst them. Magnolia flavolata, which was another one which we saw quite a lot of on the fancy pan, and also Ban Quang. It can grow up to 15 meters tall. It also grows in southern China as well. And one of the most beautiful things of this particular plant here is that the younger shoots leaves often have a fine covering of silver stroke gold hairs, which give the plant a very elegant appearance. The leaves are quite long, up to 20 centimeters. The flowers are sort of whitish color, whitish creamy color, with a honey-like fragrance. It's a really beautiful plant, very attractive leaves. It's quite a sparse growing plant. This, in terms of conservation status, is of least concern. But if you're wanting to grow it in cultivation again, grow it in light shade in a well-drained. And here you see the seed pods from Magnolia flavolata. So this is what they look like growing out in right in the center of the fancy pan. These are trees growing in the wild, and you can generally identify it from the sort of wavy margins of the leaves. And you can't actually see it here, but the actual underside of the leaves has really lovely fine hairs on it. And just look at the epiphytes which are growing in the stem. There's lots and lots of different species all growing very happily together in a symbiotic relationship. Other unusual things we came across during our trip. This is Trichosanthis pilosa, a member of the cucumber family, believe it or not. These almost look like ornamental gourds, but look what we found when you actually open up the fruit. It almost looks like pear flesh with juicy, almost seed from New Zealand flax in the centre. All variety of different colours, and they produce a storage organ. We've got these growing here at Logan. We haven't fruited them as yet, but quite an amazing plant. And who knows, you know, every year we see a new expanded range of fruits on offer in our local supermarkets. This could be the next thing. We didn't try them, so I'm not sure what they taste like. One of the most amazing plants which grows out in northern Vietnam is Schefflera macrophylla, and this was a particular plant of it here, which was dwarfing me. Just a stunning architectural plant. It's proved to be fairly hardy to -10, fast growing. We've now got lots of these around the garden here at Logan, and establishing and are loving the Western Seaboard climate. Really great plant, and just such a stunning, of all the plants we can grow in our garden, architecturally, this one here takes a real bit of beating. So the next magnolia which we wanted to try and locate was Magnolia grandis, which is endemic to China and Vietnam and classified as critically endangered, with a total population of less than 300 adult trees. One of the most beautiful, boasting dark red, fragrant flowers and long, leathery leaves, as you can see here on the right-hand side. Habitat loss and illegal logging are largely responsible for the species decline. And until recently, it was thought that the species was only occurred in southern China, with less than 50 adults restricted to an area of less than 10 square kilometers. In 2010 to 2012, the Global Tree Campaign surveys found 61 mature trees in 3 protected areas of northern Vietnam, providing some hope. In recent years, seed collection has taken place by local nurseries, resulting in seedlings being replanted back into the forest. And I'm really pleased to say that in 2015-16, more than 1,000 Magnolia grandis plants were replanted back into community forest, which is fantastic news. But the actual trek we had to this, to find these trees, it was really dense forest, and it took us probably about 7 hours into the deepest of forest. It was pouring with rain. The actual terrain was very undulating, almost like lava-like rocks, very, very sharp. And then all of a sudden, about mid-afternoon, we came into an area of probably about 15 or 20 of these enormous trees, which we'll see just shortly, growing in the middle of a really so dense environment. So here you can see we managed to collect a small number of seeds from the actual trees. This was a seed pod, and you see the lovely luxuriant foliage. Unfortunately, none of them germinated, so there's good reason there to go back to try get some additional seed to try and really try and ensure the long-term viability of the species. So this is what it looked like in the wild, and you can just see how saturated the atmosphere here is. Really great big long etiolated trees covered in epiphytes. All this very, very dense vegetation, lots of gingers around the base here, and we've managed to find a couple of lower pods, but that's all we could find. And then we made our journey back, and it probably took us about 4 hours of a walk. But this was really really enduring expedition work. This was really tested us to our limits to get here. And here you see one of the Magnolia grandis being planted out by the locals. But it's really encouraging that the locals are an absolutely, really key part to the long-term survival of this particular Magnolia species. I mentioned the book, The Selected Species of Magnolia of Zhejiang Province. These are other ones which we're really interested in trying to get for ex situ conservation. Magnolia grandis at the top from Tung Vai, which we collected, but also on Take On Lin, which we have climbed a couple of times now. Hongkiensis is another species which was quite keen to try. So during our next expedition, we'll certainly be trying to collect those ones there. And the last one there, again from Tung Vai in Zhejiang, Magnolia hookeri var longi rostrata. So this was some other conservation work going on of magnolias in Bac d'Isson. So it wasn't just one location. Here we see the magnolias. I'm not sure exactly which species this one was. And the unusual conifer here, this is Xanthocyprus vietnamensis, only discovered in the last 2 decades. And here we see a close-up of the magnolias. I'll be interested if anyone can actually identify that particular species. So this was then all being grown on in the nursery. And here is this new genus of conifer called Xanthocyprus vietnamensis. Here's a close-up of it. It's commonly called a coffin juniper, and the tree was originally cut down for making coffins. But again, here at Logan, we've got plants as part of the International Conifer Conservation Project, which were grown in the garden. So around Tung Vai in Zhejiang, there was other conservation work which was going on. There was a hillside which was planted up with this particular magnolia here. I'm not sure which particular species it was, but it was being extensively replanted, which is great, to see such encouraging conservation work taking place. The only problem was that some of the locals were actually, when it got to about 1 meter high, some of the locals were chopping the tops off. I think it was just really so that their cardamom, etc., wasn't going to be overtaken. But it's encouraging that there's still more work to be undertaken in relation to education of local people. And here we see a close-up. So again, I would be interested to find out if anyone can actually recognize that particular species of magnolia, which was being replanted. Other plants we came across, which was particularly showy, this is Lilium primulinum, Barbamanicum, which is a fantastic lilium, which is really very much at home at Logan. It flowers usually during August, and it has these really exotic oriental looking flowers and produces masses of seed in the garden. It's very easy to grow and should be grown a lot more widely. But we found and collected this one at the top of which one was it? At one of the on what can't just recall the name of the mountain, but right at the top of one of them. So I mentioned early on there about food, and you know, you need to get used to eating different types of food. So on the right-hand side here, we have bee larvae, which was okay, very, very different. But on the left-hand side here is a food which I wouldn't recommend, and this was porcupine. So one night we went to a cafe in Vat de Son, and the menu was all in Vietnamese. And I said to our guide, I said, what would you recommend from the menu? And he recommended, this is quite nice, and it was porcupine. And my colleague from Q, he selected the chicken. So next thing we heard was a chicken screech at the top of its head with its neck being pulled. And we knew where that was going to be destined for. And my meal of porcupine turned up, and it had a particularly malodor. It stunk to high heaven. It was dark brown in colour and came with its 4 legs. And I just couldn't face it. That was definitely a night for a Mars bar. So a great picture here just showing the richness of the mountains. You know, you can see all the rhododendron Sinopholconeries. You can see isolated pockets here of bamboos. But amongst all this, you've got lots and lots of different things, you know, things like polysporas, magnolias, you know, and it's very hard work making your way through this. But it was just incredibly rich. Magnolia martinii, which was another one which we came across. It grows up to a height of 20 meters in the forests of southern China and northern Vietnam at an altitude of between 1,000 to 2,000 meters. Another exciting introduction, and commemorates the little known French missionary, a botanist, Léon Martin, one of the collectors of the type specimen Martin and Baudelaire 2066 collection. Volatile oils are extracted from the flowers in China. This species is fairly tough. In Vancouver, when they grew it, it came through -9, suffering very minor damage from that and heavy snow. It's come away fine. It's very fast growing, and John Marsden down in Devon raised some seedlings which grew to 2 meters tall in 3 years. Terrain in Cornwall with Tom Hudson, he's got a specimen which has now reached 12 meters by 95 centimeters wide and flowers annually quite prolifically. But a great recent introduction. Just showing pictures of the landscape because it's so wet. There's magnificent waterfalls in the area. This is one of the ones we endured on our epic motorbike ride. This was up at the summit of Take On Lin in 2019. We've now botanized this mountain on 2 expeditions. It's still got a wealth of material to be discovered, I'm sure. Quite hard work traveling up this mountain here. You need someone at the front with a machete. There's quite a number of snakes, which you've just got to be aware of. Very, very rich vegetation, lots of rhododendrons, lots of magnolias, camellias, really great vegetation, so exciting. Up in Haijiang again, just some of the different paddy fields with the richness of the mountains to the left-hand side. Magnolia fulva grows in Yunnan in China and also in Vietnam. This can grow up to 15 meters tall. It grows in forests and a limestone at altitude of 1,690 meters to 1,950 meters. Quite a short altitudinal range. In terms of conservation, it's data deficient and very little known about it in cultivation. It's got leathery evergreen leaves, which are 13 to 24 centimeters in length and somewhat rigid. But the petioles have this really attractive yellow-brown hairs on them, and as you can see in the pictures here, so it's quite unusual. The flowers themselves are about 5 centimeters across, and in the UK normally flowers during March. It survived -7 in Portland, Oregon. Down in Cornwall, again, Tom Hudson at Tregrain has got it well established, but it generally flowers most years. So I mentioned early on, during the trip, as part of our expedition, 95% of the material which we collect is generally seed, but occasionally we do collect living plant material if it's of special interest. And this was Calocasia yunenensis, I believe, and it was the first time that it had actually been collected in Vietnam. So this is all the plant material being washed off, getting it prepared to come through quarantine. So as well as all the seed collections, every collection number had usually 4 to 5 herbarium specimens attached to it. These were all pressed as we went along. A lot of time and effort was made using these collections, and these are now in various herbaria, such as the Royal Botanic Garden, Edinburgh, across the world. I mentioned about the tribes, and technology is only just starting to really hit many of these parts of the world. At the moment, there's a lot of new hydroelectric power stations going in, but here you see the locals actually washing their clothes in the river. So going through a real period of large change for this area at the moment. Another magnolia, which we've got a lot of them growing now here at Logan, is Magnolia insignis. And it's another evergreen species again, which grows up to 15 meters tall, native to China, Myanmar, India, Nepal, and Thailand. A really attractive floweret and very widely distributed. Got oblong, leathery leaves, which grow up to 26 centimeters long, quite thick textured, and these bear beautiful pink to red scented flowers in May, June. And these are followed by the showy red fruits, as you can see there in the top, in autumn. At an altitude, it grows from 600 to 2,000 meters in mixed forests. And in terms of conservation, it's classified as least concern, so that's encouraging. It's got a very, very variable leaf size and flower, leaf size and shape, and also flower size and colour. It can be very variable in colour. Widely grown as an ornamental in its native range, and the wood is actually widely used for furniture making. A really beautiful showy species, and it's pretty quick growing, quite easy to grow this one. This is a plant which is very unusual. It's sometimes called the bull's horn plant. It was originally called Euocodendron whartonii, but has now been reclassified as Disanthus ovatifolius, a member of the Hamamelidaceae family. Very unusual with these spider-like flowers and classic seed time. Very unusual to see in cultivation. One of the most amazing rhododendrons which we came across is Rhododendron sulinense, with its very long, attractive, exotic-looking leaves. This is proving to be, pretty hardy. Again, comes through -10, but here we see it growing on the fancy pan in a sheltered spot. It needs shelter because its large leaves get very tattered. And just up front here we see Rhododendron excellens. So in total on our expeditions, I think we've collected to date something like 30 different species, and we've named so far 1 new subspecies and 1 new species, and we've hopefully got another 2 species in the pipeline to name, but we're just awaiting them to flower. Other pictures of the landscape, you see the classic Hajiang landscape with its various drumlins, highly terraced over the centuries, but quite incredible to look at. These are Magnolia, Camellia terraces for tea production, Camellia sinensis, which is widely grown in the area. Lots of interesting camellias as well. And in the last 2 decades, I believe there are 30 new species of camellias which have been discovered in southern China and northern Vietnam. So it's quite amazing, just the wealth of material here. Other things we came across, lots of gingers. As I said, we've got a particular interest in gingers because we have a botanist who works on gingers from Asia. So you've got lots of exciting species such as Hedychium europhyllum here on the right-hand side. What was it like to be camping? Well, you had to get used to, should I say, very moist nights. One of the most amazing experiences of my life was to camp here on Take on Lynn Mountain, and about 5 o'clock in the morning, a troop of monkeys came over. Now, I'd never heard what monkeys sound like, but it was just a natural instinct that I recognized them as being monkeys. And when we awoke the next morning and had a chat, everyone agreed that it had been monkeys which went over our camp, which was quite amazing. But just very sodden, but lush vegetation. And again in Hajiang, some of the landscapes. This is Bosom Hill with its karst landscape, karst limestone. Just quite incredible, the beautiful colours and textures. And just coming towards the end now, this is just showing you the exoticness of the Schefflera macrophylla. This is against Du, our Vietnamese guide. Polyspora, lots of different species of Polyspora. This is Polyspora longicarpa. Again, probably in my opinion, one of the best garden plants which has been introduced from Vietnam in recent years. It flowers essentially in the UK from December right through till May, sometimes known as a poached eggplant. So the final slide, I hope that everyone has enjoyed a wander through the mountains of northern Vietnam. If anyone's interested as well, I've also written a book called Plant Explorer, which is available at a price of £20, and it's available online from the Royal Botanic Garden Edinburgh bookshop. It's extensively illustrated, lots of lovely pictures, and it gives what it's like to be on an expedition. So thank you very much for listening, and it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
The plan was to have Richard available following his presentation because he was having some internet issues. So he recorded his presentation and he was going to be here live for Q&A. But unfortunately, I do not see him in attendance right now. So he might still be having some internet issues. So I think what we're going to do is that we are going to just move forward. And we are going to proceed with Vance Hooper with his presentation, and then we will have a combined Q&A at the end if Richard does manage to join with us. So it's our pleasure to have our second speaker, Vance Hooper of New Zealand. There is much exciting breeding work with magnolias in New Zealand. He'll be doing a PowerPoint on magnolia breeding in New Zealand, touching on Oz Blumhardt's breeding work and moving forward with other hybridizers. So Vance, the time is yours. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Todd. We'll just get this thing started. Oops, wrong way. Slides. We're going to start with a brief history of magnolias in New Zealand. And as with most garden plants, it's the passion of passionate plants people that really gets them into the gardens and into collections and in front of people's attention. But in the early days, before 1950, we had very limited range of magnolias in New Zealand. And slowly they were built up. The range was built up by direct importations through the 1950s and 60s, mostly as seedling material coming from the UK. Right from 1950 until the 90s, Duncan and Davies was importing material as well. They were importing Campbellized seedlings and selling them as pink. But Sir Victor Davies, who was rather famous owner and manager of Duncan and Davies, he got really excited and he offered to go and replace a whole tree in someone's garden so that they could actually get the white Campbellite to produce for circulation. Later into the 1990s, Duncan and Davies was importing the newest varieties available from Eisenhutz in Switzerland and from Grier's. At this point, I was working with them and we were doing the quarantining as well. Today, it's much harder to get material into New Zealand, and there hasn't actually been anything brought in since about 1995. During the 80s and 90s, specialist nurseries like Peter Cave's nursery were importing all sorts of new varieties such as Kehay's Bell, Kehay's New Purple, which later became known as JC Williams. And then once they got into circulation, several of us breeders began to propagate and breed with them. One of the foremost and most famous New Zealand Magnolia breeders was Felix Jury. He was importing Magnolias directly from the UK. And here we have Magnolia Mark Jury and Lanarth that were both imported as plants from the UK. Sorry?
I'm going to interrupt. We're not seeing your slides.
Ah, okay. Hang on, where are we? Escape. How are we going to sort this out? Slideshow. I know what I've done. Share the screen.
Yes.
That's the one. A bit new to this technology. This is only the second time we've done this. Sorry about that, folks, but we'll start again at the beginning. Over there. Move something here. That's what we need to do. Slideshow. Now, how's that? Yeah, sorry about that. Now we've got. I just need to move that little bar out of there. Can you see that or not? It's just the slide showing.
Looks great.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, that shows you the sort of part of the limited range of material that was available in New Zealand before 1950. We move on to Felix's imports. Just trying to arrange my screen here. Just take that down. Right. Oops, back up. Yeah. These are two introductions from Felix. That was the one on the left, Mark Jury, and Lanarth, which he got as grafted plants from the UK. Lanarth itself has been a wonderful plant, but not always easy to grow. But it was a starting point for quite a bit of breeding in New Zealand, both from Felix's son Mark and other breeders such as Ian Baldock. What Felix did, he started breeding with Mark Jury and had some really good results because of the heavy texture and the good perfume that's present in Mark Jury. And where are we? These are some of Felix's better known hybrids. Iolanthe, which is popular everywhere. Vulcan, which has been the base for many, many hybrids everywhere. I have only used it once in our work, but most other breeders are using it just about all the time. Then this work that Felix did laid the foundation for, as I said, the work of his son Mark, as well as guys like Oz Bloomhart. Oz Bloomhart, he collected stuff from the wild, but he also made some interesting crosses with the Michaelias. Now, just as a note here, I'm referring to Michaelias as the common name sense, and people still do that here. It helps us to distinguish them from the deciduous Magnolias. But Oz started with Touch of Pink, Bubbles, and Mixed Up Miss as hybrids of the Michaelias, and Mark Jury went on to do some interesting stuff with those as well. But among his other hybrids, Star Wars is probably one of the most world famous ones. Oz was influenced by Felix, but he was also influenced by US breeders such as Todd Gresham. And Oz went on to do quite a bit of work with Magnolia Veitchi, and he did Veitchi crossed Denudata crosses and Veitchi crossed Lily Flora crosses. And I think late 90s there was a Magnolia Society trip to New Zealand, and they identified and named one of Oz's Veitchi Lily Flora crosses as Mahogany Glow. If we move on to Mark Jury, we can see some of the stunning stuff that Mark has produced over the years, and these have been in wide circulation now. Fairy Blush was one of the first pink Michaelias that Mark had released. That's proved to be a very good plant in gardens here, and the foliage holds itself nice and tidy, and it is an overall good garden plant. Mark was dealing with Oz's hybrids for a start, Mixed Up Miss, Touch of Pink, and I was actually working for Mark and Abby in the mid-1990s when Mark started growing some of these Michaelia hybrids, and he's come up with some real stunning stuff. And from time to time, Abby does post on, I think it's the Facebook Magnolia Heaven page, some of the Michaelia seedlings that they've got to select with, and they've also gone on to release some 2 or 3 other colors. It was really interesting to work with Mark and Abby, and Felix was still alive at the time, and that gave me a bit of an insight into the way they viewed stuff back then. And because Felix, he was importing stuff right from the 1950s, and it was a slightly different era as far as understanding classification in plants and that sort of thing, but it was very interesting all the same to get that background information on what was happening back then. Ian Baldock is another New Zealand breeder, and he's possibly the most prolific Magnolia breeder that New Zealand's ever had. Well over 20 hybrids that he's produced, both using stuff from Oz, from Felix, from Mark, and he's gone on to introduce stuff all around the world as well. But one of his selections there, this was originally a Duncan and Davies seedling. He called it Mount Pirongia because it was discovered in the Waikato, not far from the mountain itself, and it's a very good, perfect cup and saucer, looks like a Molicomata type. It doesn't perform very well in the heat, so we added that into our breeding program and managed to get one good white replica of Mount Pirongia, and that has actually turned out to be a good summer flowering type. So you get these beautiful white Campbellii flowers in the middle of summer sitting on the foliage, just like you do with Magnolia grandiflora. The one at the bottom there, Purple Sensation, that's a cross between Lanarth and Lily Flora nigra. That's a very good substitution for Lanarth, because Lanarth is not always the best one to grow. It's a stunning colour, beautiful purplish red, but it's not always the easiest of plants to grow. So one of the things that the results of hybridizing has done is actually made Magnolias easier to grow in our gardens, because we're starting to feel the effects of climate change, and some of these heat sensitive types are beginning to get harder to grow, and you've got to be a little bit more careful where you plant them and looking after them to get them established. But moving on to the work that I've done firsthand, I had the privilege of working with Jim Rumble at Duncan and Davies from 1987 to 94, and he was a very good mentor. We bred a few Varroa rhododendrons, and we also got fairly well stuck into the Magnolia hybrids. We had at that stage imported stuff from Otto Eisenhut and from Greer Gardens, so we had a bit of a base to work with. But Jim helped me to set this sort of framework up to get the best out of what we were producing. Remember, Duncan and Davies was a wholesale nursery, so we had to have a set of goals that was going to be in line with Duncan and Davies themselves. And the main factor there was to have good garden plants, smaller growing plants for modern gardens. Every breeder takes a different track, and every breeder has a different idea of what they feel will be a perfect Magnolia, but every breeder does well to work on the work of others as a basis. If you started with a hybrid that's maybe 2 generations down from, say, Vulcan, you've saved probably 10 years of work by selecting very carefully the right parentage to get those qualities that are coming through from Vulcan, and which is, among other things, really good colour. And when I was at Duncan and Davies, we set up trial beds with quite a few Magnolia seedlings, 350 odd seedlings over about 15 crosses. And the idea was to create as much diversity as possible. Keith Hammett, Dahlia and Sweet Pea breeder here, he says, if you're going to breed plants, you need diversity and sieves. So in other words, you create as much diversity as you can, and then figure out the filter system as to what you want to achieve. You have to be open to all sorts of possibilities, because it's all very well setting out to plan across and hoping what you'll get, but you'll be surprised along the way with some really pleasant surprises, stuff that you wouldn't have dreamed possible. But also there's several crosses that you're going to work out they're going to be a waste of time. But even if you have a cross that is a waste of time, you have learned from it, because if you don't do that cross, you always wonder what would happen if. And if you do it, you know what's going to happen. And if you know it's a waste of time, then you can forget about it and move on. One of the big breakthroughs, I think, for my breeding line particularly, was the discovery of Magnolia Sweet Simplicity. This is a small to medium sized Solangiana with a very clear shape and form, very clean habit. The little sepals there are sometimes there, sometimes not in the seedlings, and that helps to tidy up the flowers that you're producing. It has a good compact habit, and it's very free flowering. When I found it as a chance seedling in a nursery, it was growing in a small 2 litre, 3 litre pot, about maybe a metre high, and it had 2 flower buds. It really, really wanted to flower, but given those conditions, it shouldn't have been setting flower buds. So I figured that would be a really good basis to start a breeding program with, because you've got a seedling that really, really wants to flower. And later analysis shows it has a very high chromosome count and it's very fertile. I selected that in 1987, and I did use it reasonably extensively at Duncan and Davies. Some of the results I got from the work at Duncan and Davies, we have Margaret Helen, which was named after my mother in 1996. That was Liliflora nigra crossed with Bernie Hollard. That's proved very popular in the UK and Europe because it's got such a bright colour. It's a small to medium sized tree, which is part of that original brief that Jim and I were setting out to establish. And it's still one of my favourite plants. It's all round good performer. Using Sweet Simplicity with Liliflora nigra, we produced Old Port. I'm not sure how widely that has become available, but I'm sure it is in Europe and the UK. Has a stunning red bloom with that flush on the inside. But I can remember when the first seedling went to flower, I just kept watching and watching and watching, and the flower just never seemed to really want to open. But I could see the stunning red colour on the inside, and eventually it opened up to reveal that centre. And it's also a good small garden plant. The other one we raised at Duncan and Davies was Amethyst Flame. That was Liliflora cross Vulcan. That's a small columnar tree, maybe 3 metres high by a bit over 1 metre wide in 20 years. And that also has a good range of summer flowers. The summer flowering effect on the hybrids is very useful because it helps to slow down the growth of the plant, and that's ideal for smaller garden plants. A good compact form and free flowering is the best what you need. Now, in 2005, there was quite a bit of water went under the bridge between Duncan and Davies in the early 90s. I worked for Mark Jury and Abajuri for 4 years. Then I went to Tauranga, which was the other side of the island for a while, and left Magnolia breeding for a little while. And then came back to Taranaki, and then we had the opportunity in 2005 to set up Magnolia Grove. Some of the seedlings I had raised in the interim were starting to show promise, and I'd done a range of seedlings grown from Genie. So in spring 2004, I had sown seed to test Genie as a Magnolia breeder. It's turned out quite a useful exercise, and we established our property here at Magnolia Grove. First of all, it was that section there. We had 2 acres or 8,000 square meters. We planted a selection of seedlings and planted a collection of magnolias in the garden, as well as a small cactus collection there. We established a nursery between the garden and the main road so that we didn't get too much traffic noise, because that's what the main highway in and out of Taranaki. And that the positioning here has proved beneficial in the last 10 years as we've been opening the garden and selling directly to the public from the nursery. In 2008, we were able to establish the main Magnolia collection there. This is a reference collection of New Zealand raised hybrids, and we're using that as a reference collection to compare what we're breeding and to make sure that we don't reinvent the wheel. Because sometimes if people are raising a handful of seedlings, they'll name them, they'll get into circulation, and it's very easy to reinvent that sort of thing if you're not careful. We've got a very mild climate here, so it's really hard to test hardiness. So we have to rely on results from overseas. Anywhere in New Zealand where you can test the hardiness similar to overseas, Magnolias generally won't survive through the summer. So we just got to suck it and see, and distribute trial material to get it tested in Europe and North America. Magnolia Genie has certainly been one of the winners for us. It's got a excellent compact habit, very free flowering, and flowers with good flowering in the summer. it's highly fertile, and it's got one of the highest chromosome counts of the Solangiana hybrids. And we're able to get it to flower 1.5 years from tissue culture, which was a bit of a surprise. But in saying that, when it was a seedling, it flowered at the end of the second year. And that free flowering habit has been thrown into some of the seedlings as well. When we did a big batch of seedlings, we did a couple hundred Magnolias cylindrica crossed with Genie, and about 40 of those seedlings flowered 18 months from seed. So they had their first flowers in the summer, halfway through their second growing season. It wasn't easy to evaluate because a summer flower is way different to a spring flower, but that shows you the tendency to want to flower and the potential that Genie has as a magnolia for breeding. There's a breeder in Poland called Janusz Radicki, and he shows some of the hybrids that he's produced on Facebook from time to time, and he's got some real stunner plants there that are taking Magnolia hybrids to the next level again. But I don't mind that, because it's all about getting good plants into people's gardens in the end. And if we're building on each other's work moving forward, then everybody's going to benefit with good plants in their gardens. In 2006, we had a trip to the UK. Catherine and I, we went on a all expenses paid by the New Zealand government tax deductible honeymoon, and went to visit collections in Europe and in the UK. We spent a couple of hours with Charles Williams, getting the historical background of a lot of the Magnolias there, and how they were actually gathering material up from around the world again into their collections as well. And also the time spent with Nigel Holman was beneficial, because he gave us some insights on how the Magnolias from Shiverton and from Kearhayes were sent up to Hilliers and grown, and sometimes they had disastrous results with some major frosts. But looking at how the Magnolias were growing over there was very useful. And as I said, Magnolia cylindrica was something that proved very hardy over there. So when we came back after visiting the collections in Belgium and the Netherlands, we started setting about doing some more crosses with those varieties. So when it comes to crunching the numbers, it's really a case of when more definitely is better, and you really got to crunch the numbers to get the results. 2006, we did 30 odd crosses with producing 1,700 odd seedlings, and as I said, the cylindrica Genie cross, we had 220 seedlings raised, but only one got named. And we saw Magnolia albatross at Lanhydrock in Cornwall. That was an interesting plant. We managed to get pollen of that from in New Zealand here. We raised 80 seedlings. None of them were really stunning, but we did actually name one after 10 years, and that is Magnolia Still Me. This was a really good pink on a nice rounded small tree with tidy foliage, and wasn't too big a grower, and I decided to start growing it. But at that time we had just early on in that sorry, I'm just trying to shift this bar here. We had Dementia New Zealand approach us to ask if we had a Magnolia that they could name. So we named this, or they named the Magnolia Still Me, and we're contributing proceeds from the sale of this Magnolia for research into dementia in New Zealand. It's a really good all-round garden plant. It's not a world beater or anything that's totally outstanding, but it's a reliable plant that people can plant in their garden, and they can have it as a remembrance tree or something similar to remember a loved one who has suffered from dementia, because it is a cruel disease, and we do need to support research in this area. So, and we're doing our little bit as far as that goes. But how else do you select a winner? We've been through this process of crunching the numbers, and that we get to a stage where you have all these seedlings lying around. How do you spend the time to sort them out? In the end, they really do sort themselves out. You can put it simply, if you have 100 seedlings, you can look at them with a magnifying glass. But if you've got 1,000 seedlings, you really do need to look at them with a chainsaw. And what happens in that situation, and particularly with a cross we had of Magnolia Genie cross with Kehay's Bell, we had a very bright pink halfway up the row. And every time you walked around the corner, your eye went to that particular tree. So you could ignore the rest, and that tree basically chose itself to be propagated out of that row. Again, it was about 80 seedlings, but only one of those seedlings was named, and that had actually chosen itself. But when we go to pick our winners, we have a bit of a checklist to work through, and it's, first of all, the tree flowers. So you think, oh, that's pretty good. So we do some trial plants in the nursery to put it through the production system. First question is it different enough? And if it didn't catch your eye, it couldn't be very different. So you pick these plants, you graft a few in the nursery, and then see how it performs. Is it a good nursery plant? Is the foliage healthy? Does it set flowers? Does it set flowers in the first year? Because that makes it a saleable plant, and you can compete with impulse sales. And does it make a nice plant there? See, that's one we call Summer Magic. In the Northern Hemisphere, it's marketed as Pink Pyramid. Perfect plant. The branching system is like a herringbone effect. And if you happen to be exporting plants, they would stack up on one another, because that's only a two-dimensional plant. But it's very, very well framed, and every tip pretty much has a flower bud on it. The additional summer flowering is an added bonus, and that's a major factor in our breeding selection process. If you have a plant that's making summer flowers, that means the growth through the summer season hesitates, and you get a summer display of flowers. The overall size of your plant is going to be smaller, and it's going to fit into that initial prerequisite of being a good garden plant for small gardens. But we do have to maintain quality. We have a pressure to get results, because we are by no means financially independent as a breeding operation here, or as a nursery. So we do have a pressure to get results, but we also have to make sure that we are maintaining quality, so we don't compromise anywhere along the way. The Magnolia breeding work here is done alongside the production nursery, where we grow citrus and magnolias. So we have to balance everything out to make sure it's done properly. And how do we name a plant? Picking a name it's not that easy. You've got to remember that a good name can be wasted on average plants, and good plants can be hindered with average names. We've had a name kicking around for probably 12 years, 14 years, and that was the name Summer Magic, which we finally applied to one of our hybrids that was released a couple of years ago, because it flowered really, really heavily in the summer. And finally we have a good place for that name, and that's on a good magnolia. But that's the one, as I say, is available in the Northern Hemisphere as Magnolia Pink Pyramid. On the subject of names, that wasn't my choice to have it marketed as Pink Pyramid. I thought we could do better than that, but the that's the way the marketing people want to go with it. So we let them go. One important thing is to avoid colour in the Magnolia name. If you sort of indicate a colour in a flower, you may come unstuck when the colours vary in different climates and different soil. Perhaps the latest one that we released is called Watermelon, and it's got a bright watermelon pink colour. That was, again, sort of a nickname, but it's not a bad name for the market, given that watermelons do come in various shades of pink. So we can win just about anywhere with that one, and that is performing really well both in the Netherlands and in North America. These three plants here, Cleopatra, Genie and Cameo, they are some of our earlier hybrids. They've gone worldwide and they're doing well in the marketplaces over there. Cleopatra has an elegance of metallic purple. Genie has magical qualities of being a very good breeder. And Cameo has a rose form, and it's not one I initially wanted to release, but our agent at the time said you really do have to do that one. So I trialed it for flower production against Genie and came up with the name Cameo because I called it OK Red to start with. It was okay. It was too good to chuck out, but I didn't think it was good enough to name, so it only made a cameo appearance in my mind, just like Alfred Hitchcock makes a cameo appearance in his movies. But the name Cameo has been a good name for that plant, and it's a very good plant for especially windy conditions like we have here in Taranaki. We've got a plant very close to the house. It's performing really well. Makes a small to medium rounded tree, about 4 meters in 20 years. So where to from here? Has anybody out there got a purple leaf magnolia? Because that's something I've been looking for. We have one truly weeping magnolia. Over the years, I've seen seedlings that weep. As soon as you graft them, they start going back up to normal. And that sort of indicates there was something wrong with their roots, so that they couldn't actually have the strength to stand up. But this little weeper here, which is a hybrid between Forest's Pink and Genie, is a true weeper. But that's sort of the sum total of flowers you get per square metre of canopy. So we need to do a little bit of work with that and hopefully see whether the weeping tendencies are there in the seedlings. But a break like a genetic weeper or a purple leaf magnolia would open a whole new universe in breeding. And that brings us to a close as far as our presentation goes. Okay.
Absolutely amazing.
Thank you. Just hoping that it wasn't too scientific and disappointing from too many, not having too many flash photos.
I don't think anybody's going to be disappointed or was disappointed. All right, I think at this time, if you are okay with that, Vance, if we would like to have a little bit of Q&A going on.
Sure.
So, Matt, I think we're just going to have it through the Q&A, not through chat, correct?
Sure, yeah, I think that would probably be easiest.
Okay. So if you would like to ask a question, there is a little Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if you'd like to go ahead and click on that, we can get it going. All right, so we got a comment from Carol. It says, absolutely fabulous from a novice Magnolia lover. Thank you. It's not a question, but a great praise.
So it's always good to get that feedback.
Anyone else? It's a great opportunity. So Peter's asking, what is your pollination procedures?
Pollination procedures. Normally our magnolias flower through July, August, September, and I don't tend to do much hybridizing until September because there's always a chance of frost taking it out. I generally just select the parents, collect the pollen, clean and dry the pollen before using it, and then go out with a paintbrush. Historically, our magnolias tended to be closed while female receptive, but in the last few years, warmer conditions in spring mean it's been opening up more. So I just fold the tepals down and keep the weather off the stigmas once they've been pollinated. Very occasionally I'll do some crossing indoors in plants, but most of my work's done outside on the trees, and I either write with felt tip pen on the stem or put a little marker twisty tie around where the seed pod's going to form.
All right, Peter had another quick follow-up question. Do you cover the newly pollinated flowers or just take away the tepals?
No, I don't take away the tepals. I just fold some tepals over to discourage the bees from getting in there.
All right.
And of course, you've got to have good records. Don't
Yes.
forget the records.
We have a question here. Why isn't Fairy Blush hardly available in the US? It's fantastic.
I don't know. Fairy Blush, it is a damn good plant, but I'm not sure whether it's a propagation issue or what, but it is a damn good plant and it should be available.
Yeah. Are pure species a part of the reference collection at Magnolia Grove?
No, we do have a limited space, but we have species in other parts of the garden, but not as part of the, well, and technically they're part of the reference collection, but we have one section of the garden that's allocated to the New Zealand raised collection there. That's Solangiana Campbellii hybrids.
Next question, is it possible to obtain new Magnolia varieties not through hybridization, but through grafting and getting chimeras?
I don't know. Technically, I suppose it is, but I have never seen adventitious shoots form on magnolias. That is, shoots that form from callus tissue. Some plants that sucker from their roots or from the callus when you cut a bud back on like a cornice, sometimes they'll callus around the top of the cut and make adventitious shoots. But I've never seen that on magnolias.
Yeah, agree. Another one here. So Old Port grows in the northern parts of Sweden, so it's been spread to Europe.
Wow, that's good.
Next, it says, I'm very interested in Magnolia cameo for its two-tone flowers, typical of saucer magnolias in dwarf form. How did it compare to Genie in your trials in terms of flower production? Is it fragrant? Could you comment on its mature width?
The mature width of a plant is about sort of 3 to 4 meters, and it's more or less a rounded plant, probably slightly taller than wide. Flower power, it's not as heavy as Genie, but it's would be the top 3 as far as flower production goes as a garden plant. And in our garden we have cameo because it flowers and branches so much. We have the finches nesting in it a lot because it has lots of little narrow forks where the finches can make their nests.
Is it fragrant?
Slightly fragrant, yeah. There's
Okay.
very few of the deciduous magnolias will actually generate a perfume like Michaelias do. A Michelia, you can smell it on the breeze, or Magnolia delaveo, you can smell it you can smell it before you know the flowers are there.
Right.
But there's very few deciduous magnolias that will do that.
Okay. What's the best time of the year, months to visit New Zealand magnolia collections?
That used to be an easy question to answer, but this year we had hardly any frost, and the magnolias stopped reading the calendar. Normally you would have a sequence in the garden, and you know that one's going to flower, then that one's going to flower, and then if that one's flowering, that one should be flowering. But they were all over the show in our garden. And normally you would have probably for Auckland Botanic Gardens, you would have late July as a peak time. Down into Taranaki here, late August would be a peak time. And there's lots of other gardens around here to visit. And yeah, late August into September. And for us, we still have yellow magnolias flowering toward the end of October.
Yeah, that seems to be also kind of the running joke with the Magnolia Society International with our annual meeting is we never can predict when the magnolias are going to breed. And it seems like when the date is picked, they're not going to be actually flowering.
You've just got to get good photographic backup, pin them in the trees.
Exactly. All right. Another comment or question says, I'm curious of any developments you may be considering regarding improved fragrance. Any considerations or value with this area of breeding?
Yeah, it's probably a long-term thing, and I would, to follow that one up, I would go down the track of Springer Idiva hybrids, Kehe's Bell hybrids. They have quite a strong fragrance, and there's one called Cascade Salmon here, which is one of the ones that does emanate a perfume, but I actually don't have any plans to do that at this stage.
Okay. Do you do any intergeneric crosses?
No.
So you mentioned differing chromosome counts on different cultivars. Is this something that has to be accounted for in hybridization?
Definitely. I mentioned Jeannie had a very high chromosome count, and if you cross anything onto Jeannie, the seedlings come out pretty much Jeannie seedlings. If you cross Jeannie onto something else, you have a big selection of chromosomes with a limited number of placements. So you end up doing like the ink blot test. If you've got 50 peanuts to put in 10 cups, you're only going to get so many. Every time you do it, you're only going to get so many different peanuts into different cups, and you'll get a different selection. And by doing that, you actually see some of the different color pigments that are within Jeannie herself. We've been really lucky with the breeding that we have, and a lot of our colors are clean colors and bright colors, and that may actually go back to the original Liliflora nigra that we used to get the hybrids going for the start, because there are various forms of Liliflora nigra around, and they're not, some of them are quite dull in color and some of them are quite bright. So if you're doing that ink blot effect of big chromosome numbers spread across lots of little chromosome number seed trees, you're going to get different colors come out with the different seedlings.
Awesome. Next one's just a comment from Douglas. Says, just a comment for Vance. Great presentation, good historical background, very informative. Thank you.
Thanks, Douglas.
And Linda as well says, excellent presentations. Thank you. And here we have a question. It says, what is the preferred rootstock for grafting on?
We prefer Magnolia rustica rubra seedlings, mainly because that's the first one I could source easily. We used to go traveling up country for 3 or 4 hours to pick magnolias in the autumn, and we've established our own seed orchards here to get our own seeds. And fortunately, during the 2020 lockdown, we had enough seed on the property to cover our needs. But rustica is it's a fairly even line of seedlings and slightly dwarfing. But some of the varieties actually, it doesn't matter what rootstock you put them on, they are going to do what they do as their variety, and they'll ignore the seedling and go their normal size. But as I said, it started off as a matter of convenience that it's rustica. We did try Lenio alba, but the seedlings are erratic and too hard to get a uniform stage. So we've settled with rustica rubra.
Nice. Which is for you your best selection?
Wow.
What's your favorite child?
Yeah, that's right. So it's just like that. They've all got their fine points, and they all annoy you in some way. Jeannie's got to be. I would struggle to. I could probably do top 5 and no particular order. I'd go with Jeannie, Margaret Helen, probably Pink Pyramid, Summer Magic, and Emperor, which is one that's yet to come onto the drawing board. It's a cross with Felix Jury and Jeannie, and that is a good clear red. Jeannie color inside and out on a bloom about half the size of Felix, but on a tree, smaller growing garden tree. So it's 4. It's a hard one. They're all good, otherwise we wouldn't be producing them.
Oh, that's amazing. Do you recommend any favorite cultivars with a very narrow or pyramidal form?
Depends where you are. Janos Radicki is releasing next year in Europe a very slender form of Genie hybrid cross with March till Frost. That looks almost like a Lombardy poplar, and that is one I would recommend. I've only seen photographs of it, and I don't know what its growing habits for climate are, but the flower power is really there. So that's one I'd recommend. Pink Pyramid is one of our hybrids that's getting around now. That's 1.5 meters by 4 meters high in 10 years. Other than that, it's hard to pick any that are definitely upright. We saw one at Wim Rutten's garden in the Netherlands in 2006, and that was Sentinel, I think it was. I think that was originally a Todd Gresham hybrid.
Very nice. Jim says, great presentation. Can any of your magnolias be grown on their own roots?
Yes, most of our magnolias are growing in tissue culture, and that is making export and distribution easier. Other than that, softwood cuttings done in early summer work on most of the varieties. We tend to graft our stuff here because our climate is so mild. We don't get good ripening of cuttings before the longest day, and if you want to do magnolias from cuttings, you need long day length for them to root on. So for us, keeping it simple is actually grafting seedlings.
Nice. We have a comment, says Ramald. Great fastigiate variety from Jeunesse.
Oh, yes.
And so another question, any grafting tips?
Don't get them too wet. Don't have the conditions too wet when you're grafting. I do quite a bit of dormant wood grafting. If, say, I see a seedling that's looking good, I look at the most dormant part of the tree and then take it away, take a scion or two away and graft them on another tree or rootstock in the nursery outside. Whip and tongue graft tied with black insulation tape, a little bit of grease on the cut tips so the scion doesn't dry out, and leave them to the elements. That works well for us in a harder climate. And this is something we shared with Joop Vergelt when we were there in 2006. Spring budding. If you collect dormant wood in the winter, and then from us mid-October onwards, or Northern Hemisphere would be probably mid-April onwards, field budding, and then tipping the rootstocks 2 weeks from budding, and then total head back 6 weeks from budding.
Excellent. Well, we currently do not have any more open questions. Vance, thank you so much. You're a wealth of knowledge. Actually, I have one last question. So I was working with Dennis Ledvina before he passed, and I remember him saying that flower color follows pollen. What are your thoughts on that?
Flower color follows pollen.
Yeah, so to get the color to cross, you make sure that the color is coming from the male.
Yeah, that's probably right.
Okay.
Especially with the case of Jeannie. We put Jeannie onto I think it was yellow bird, and then you get a whole range of different colors. Some of the seedlings were really dark like Jeannie, and some of them were pastel shades, but you're getting back to that ink blot effect.
Yeah.
Where you're seeing what genes are there and spread out.
Okay, awesome. Well, thank you. Any last minute questions for Vance? All right. Well, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you so much for your time. This has been awesome.
That's good. Glad you enjoyed it.
All right. Well, thank you all the attendees, all the members and non-members alike who came and visited with us. This is a rare opportunity to see, New Zealand and what's going on with the breeder, and then also to be able to see what's going on with collections in Vietnam. So I wish Richard would have been able to join us to be able to answer some questions as well, because definitely from his presentation, I had some questions. It was interesting to hear about porcupine, but